The Watcher in the Woods. I had always loved hiking alone. There's something serene about being enveloped by nature, away from the noise of everyday life. But one particular trip into the woods changed everything. It was late autumn, the leaves a fiery tapestry of red and gold. I set off early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. As I ventured deeper, the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. Nature can be quiet sometimes. After a couple of hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a beautiful scene that felt almost surreal. I decided to take a break, sipping water while soaking in the tranquility. But as I sat there, a strange feeling washed over me, as if I was being watched. I glanced around, dismissing the thought as paranoia, just the trees, I told myself. Yet the feeling persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I stood up, trying to shake off the unease, and decided it was time to head back. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees. My heart raced. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but nothing was there. Just shadows playing tricks on me, I reasoned. I quickened my pace, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. The path I had taken now felt foreign. Every twist and turn seemed unfamiliar, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, but all I saw were the gnarled branches swaying in the wind. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led back toward the parking area, the other deeper into the woods. My gut told me to take the first, but something tugged at my curiosity. I took the second path, convinced it would lead me back quicker. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees closed in, their twisted trunks and thick branches blocking the sunlight. I heard a faint rustling behind me, but chose to ignore it, focusing on finding my way back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing, one I had never seen before. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. Just as I started to turn back, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, among the trees, stood a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes staring directly at me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he wore tattered clothing that blended with the bark of the trees. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raspy and barely audible. I could see his mouth moving, but I felt a pull inside me not to approach him. I turned to run, heart pounding, but he called out again, "You can't escape." The words chilled me to the bone. I bolted down the path, branches snagging at my clothes, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't look back until I reached the fork again. The other path seemed like a bad idea, but I had no choice. I chose it, praying it would lead me out. I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, fueled by adrenaline. Finally, I spotted a glimmer of light through the trees, the parking area. I sprinted toward it, fear giving me strength. I burst through the tree line and into the open, collapsing against my car. I looked back, half expecting the figure to emerge from the woods. But there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the fading light of day. I drove away, heart racing, vowing never to hike alone again. Months later, I still think about that day. What was that figure? Was he really lost, or was he something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear his voice echoing in my mind, a reminder that not all who wander in the woods make it back. The caller. I had just settled into bed when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, half expecting a robocall. "Hello," I said, but all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. I hung up, brushing it off as a prank. It was late, after all. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was the same number. I ignored it, feeling uneasy. Then came the text. "I see you." My heart sank. I glanced out my window into the darkness, seeing only my quiet street. Trying to shake off the fear, I turned off my phone and went to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced, imagining the worst. The next morning, I received another message. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I decided to block the number. A week passed, and I thought I was in the clear. Then, late one night, I heard a noise outside my window, a soft tapping. My heart raced as I crept to the curtain, peering through the slats. Nothing, just the empty street, I returned to bed, feeling foolish for being scared. Then my phone buzzed again. It was a new message, "Look outside." My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring at the screen. Against my better judgment, I approached the window. When I looked out, my heart dropped. There, in the moonlight, stood a figure. I couldn't see their face, but they were staring directly at me. Panicking, I backed away, tripping over my own feet. I fumbled for my phone to call the police. Just as I hit dial, the figure moved closer. I could barely breathe, fear paralyzing me. Then I heard the most chilling sound, my own voice echoing from the phone. "I see you." I turned to my screen in horror, realizing the figure was right outside, mocking me. The basement. My grandmother's house was old and creaky, but I loved visiting her during the summer. She had a basement filled with antiques, and one day curiosity got the better of me. I ventured down the rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. Dust danced in the beams of light filtering through the small window. My grandmother had always warned me never to go down there alone, but I was determined to explore. As I rummaged through boxes, I found an old, ornate mirror. It looked out of place, the glass clouded with age. I wiped it with my sleeve, and my reflection blinked back at me, except it didn't look quite right. For a moment, I saw not just myself, but a dark figure behind me in the mirror. I spun around, but the basement was empty. Shaking off the sensation, I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but now my reflection looked distorted, grinning maliciously. I felt a chill run down my spine. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, attempting to shake off my fear. But every time I looked away, I could feel its presence creeping closer. Suddenly, I heard my grandmother calling from upstairs. Relieved, I set the mirror down and rushed to the stairs. As I ascended, I glanced back. The reflection was still there, grinning wider. I never went back to the basement again. To this day, I wonder what I really saw that day. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear whispers from below, beckoning me to return. The doll. I inherited an old porcelain doll from my aunt when she passed away. It was beautiful, albeit a bit eerie with its cracked face and lifelike eyes. I placed it on my shelf, but soon after strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. I'd find the doll turn slightly, its gaze seemingly following me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then one night, I awoke to the sound of soft giggling. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:00 a.m. My heart raced as I listened. The giggling continued, growing louder. I sat up, scanning my dark room. That's when I noticed the doll was no longer on the shelf. I leaped out of bed, scanning the room in a panic. Suddenly, I spotted it in the corner, standing upright on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, revealing the doll standing there, as if it had been placed intentionally. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and put it back on the shelf. The giggling stopped immediately, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. I convinced myself it was a prank or a dream. The next day, I decided to get rid of the doll. I placed it in a box and took it to the local thrift shop. As soon as I got home, my phone buzzed. A notification from a social media group. Look what I found. It was a picture of the doll, smiling eerily from the shop window. Panic surged through me. I rushed back to the store, but the doll was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Now I keep hearing that giggle, sometimes in the dead of night. I'm terrified it's coming for me, that it's still out there, waiting for me to take it back. The shadow in the hall. It was a rainy night, and I had just settled in for a cozy evening with a book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I felt safe in my little apartment. As I turned the pages, I noticed a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision. I glanced up, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I focused on my book, but the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Eventually, I decided to make some tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I walked into the kitchen, I felt it again, a chill creeping up my spine. I turned to look back at the hallway. This time, I was sure I saw something move. It was quick, just a blur, but it felt like it was watching me. My heart raced. I made my tea and returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. After finishing a few pages, I decided to take a break and check my phone. As I scrolled, I heard a soft whisper echo from the hallway. "Come play." I froze, my throat tightened. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, but something deep inside urged me to stay silent, to not respond. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Come play with me." Terror gripped me. I tiptoed to the hallway, peering into the darkness. My heart pounded as I felt the temperature drop. Suddenly, the lights flickered and I saw it, a small dark figure standing at the end of the hall, staring at me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. I stumbled back into the living room, grabbing my phone to call for help, but the power went out. Darkness enveloped me. The whisper came again, closer now. "Why are you running?" I could barely breathe as I fumbled for a flashlight. Just as I turned it on, the figure lunged toward me. I screamed, bolting for the front door. I slammed it shut behind me and ran into the rain, not looking back until I reached the streetlight down the block. I spent the night with a neighbor, too terrified to return home. I never did find out what that shadow was, but every time it storms now, I hear the whispers creeping back into my mind. The last train. I was returning home late one night after a long day at work. The subway was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I found a seat and settled in, grateful for the brief moment of quiet. The train jerked forward, the familiar hum lulling me into a daze. At the next stop, an old man boarded. He was disheveled, his clothes tattered, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He sat across from me, staring intently. I felt a chill as he grinned, revealing yellow teeth. I looked away, trying to focus on my phone. The train rattled through the dark tunnels, and I felt the atmosphere shift. The lights flickered ominously, and I glanced back at the old man. He was still staring, but now his grin was wider, more unsettling. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the carriage into darkness. A few startled gasps echoed in the gloom. I felt my heart race as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. Just as I switched it on, the lights flickered back to life. The old man was gone. My pulse quickened, and I scanned the carriage. Passengers looked confused, but there was no sign of the man. I leaned back, trying to calm myself. Maybe he had gotten off at the last stop. Then the lights flickered again, this time longer. I braced myself, my eyes darting around. A feeling of dread washed over me. Suddenly, the train lurched to a halt. The announcement crackled over the intercom, but the words were garbled. I looked at my phone. 2:30 a.m. My stop was next. I could see the dim light of the platform ahead. As the train doors slid open, I stood to leave, but something made me pause. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows of the carriage. There he was, the old man, his face contorted in a horrifying snarl, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "Don't go," he rasped. I bolted off the train, adrenaline surging. I turned back for just a second, and he was gone, as if he had never been there. The platform was empty except for me. I stumbled away, glancing back, half expecting to see him again. I never took the subway alone at night after that. Sometimes I can still hear his voice in the silence, urging me to stay. The forgotten child. Growing up, I often played in my grandmother's attic. It was a treasure trove of old toys and dusty books, and one day I discovered an old wooden chest. Intrigued, I pried it open and found a collection of vintage dolls, their faces cracked and worn. But one doll stood out, a small porcelain girl with hauntingly sad eyes. I took her down to my room, naming her Layla. I felt an instant connection, like she understood me. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. I'd find Leela in different positions when I returned home from school. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination. One night, I was lying in bed, the doll on my nightstand. I heard a soft voice, barely a whisper. "Help me." I bolted upright, my heart racing. The room was dark, but I could see Leela sitting there, her gaze fixed on me. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just a dream. The next day, I decided to research the doll. I found an old article about a girl who had gone missing decades ago. Her name was Leela. The article mentioned how her parents had searched for her, but never found her body. That night, I placed Leela back in the attic, feeling uneasy. but the following morning she was back on my nightstand. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to ignore her, but the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." One night, I finally lost it. I shouted at the doll, demanding to know what she wanted. To my horror, the room grew icy cold. The lights flickered, and I heard the voice clearer than ever. "I'm still here." I ran to the attic, intending to lock Leela away for good. But when I opened the chest, it was empty. The dolls were gone, and a single note lay inside: "You can't forget me." I never saw Leela again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear soft whispers in my dreams, begging for help. I've moved far away from that house, but I still feel her presence lingering, a shadow in my memory. The mirror. I've always been fascinated by antiques, so when I stumbled upon a beautiful ornate mirror at a thrift store, I had to have it. It was old and a bit tarnished, but it had an air of elegance that drew me in. I brought it home and hung it in my bedroom. The first few nights were uneventful, but soon I started to notice something odd. When I'd glance at the mirror, I sometimes saw fleeting shadows behind me, just out of sight. I brushed it off as my imagination. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I turned to look, but my room was empty. Confused, I turned back to the mirror, and there it was again, this time a dark figure standing right behind me, its face obscured in shadow. I gasped and spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced, and I decided to cover the mirror with a blanket, hoping that would help. The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an inexplicable dread. I uncovered the mirror, and the moment I did, a cold breeze swept through the room. I saw my reflection staring back at me, but behind me stood the dark figure, clearer now, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I screamed, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it leaned closer, as if trying to whisper something. I bolted out of the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The following day, I took the mirror back to the thrift store, refusing to look at it again. But as I was leaving, I felt a sharp chill and turned back. The mirror was gone. The shopkeeper had already sold it to someone else. Now, every night, I find myself glancing toward the empty wall where the mirror used to hang. I can still feel its presence, waiting for me to invite it back. The uninvited guest. I live alone in a cozy little house on the outskirts of town. One night, after a long day, I decided to indulge in a movie marathon. As I settled onto the couch with popcorn, I heard a soft knock at the door. I paused the movie, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. Hesitantly, I got up and peered through the peephole. I saw a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing on my porch. She looked lost and scared. "Hello," I called through the door. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer, just stood there, shivering slightly in the cold night air. My heart softened at the sight. I unlocked the door, but before I could open it, I hesitated. What if she was lost? "Do you need help?" I asked, feeling the weight of the decision. The girl looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "I can't find my way home," she whispered. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. "Come in and warm up," I said, feeling a mix of concern and fear. As she stepped inside, I noticed her clothes were dirty, her hair unkempt. She looked around, and for a moment, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I ushered her into the living room and offered her some hot chocolate. As she sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced at the walls, then at me. "Can you help me find my home?" she asked, her voice soft but unsettling. "Of course. Where do you live?" I replied, trying to remain calm. "I can't remember," she said, her gaze drifting to the window, "but I'm supposed to be there before dark." Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, and I felt an urge to run. "Okay, let's get you some shoes and a jacket," I said, standing up. As I turned to grab a coat, I heard a whisper, soft yet clear, "You shouldn't have let her in." I froze. I turned back to the girl, but she was staring blankly at the wall, her expression vacant. The air thickened, and I felt a wave of fear crash over me. "Where did you come from?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I came from the woods," she said, her tone almost robotic. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. "Stay right here," I said, backing away slowly. I hurried to grab my phone, but when I looked back, she was gone, just vanished. The front door creaked open, and I felt the cold wind rush through the house. Heart pounding, I bolted to the door and slammed it shut, locking it tight. I spent the night on edge, unable to shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for me to open the door again. The house across the street. I moved into a new neighborhood, excited about the fresh start. The first night, I noticed an old, decrepit house across the street. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds. Despite its state, I felt drawn to it. Something about the house intrigued me. I often found myself staring at it, imagining the stories hidden within its walls. One evening, as I was settling in, I saw a flicker of light coming from the house. Curious, I grabbed my jacket and decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I felt a strange pull, as if the house was beckoning me. I creaked open the rusty gate and walked up the overgrown path. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. My heart raced with excitement and fear. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. I stepped cautiously into the dimly lit living room. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards creaked beneath my weight. I moved further into the house, drawn by the flickering light. It led me to a small room in the back. As I entered, I found an old lamp casting a soft glow, illuminating a dusty rocking chair in the corner. Suddenly, I heard a soft laugh echo through the room. I spun around, heart pounding. "Hello," I called, but no one answered. The laughter came again, a child's voice, sweet yet haunting. "Come play with me." Panicking, I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence closing in. I banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," I screamed. The laughter turned into a cacophony of voices, children's giggles and whispers swirling around me. I could see shapes forming in the shadows, moving closer, their eyes glinting with mischief. In a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself against the door, and it swung open. I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I reached my front porch. I turned to look back at the house, breathless. The light was gone, and the door was now firmly closed, the laughter silenced. I never went near that house again, but I could still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back. The photograph. I found an old camera at a flea market, its leather case worn and cracked. Intrigued, I bought it for a few dollars, excited to see what kinds of pictures it might take. When I got home, I loaded it with film and decided to take some shots around my neighborhood. The camera felt oddly heavy in my hands, but I shrugged it off. I snapped photos of the park, my house, and the street. Each click felt satisfying, but something about the camera seemed off. Later that evening, I developed the photos in my makeshift darkroom. As the images appeared, I was struck by a strange feeling. The first few shots were fine, but then I came across one that made my blood run cold. In the background of my photo of the park, I could see a figure, an old man standing beneath a tree. I didn't remember seeing anyone there when I took the picture. The old man looked directly at the camera, his eyes dark and hollow. I tried to shake off the unease, thinking it was just a coincidence. But as I continued developing the photos, I found more unsettling images. Each shot featured the old man in the background, lurking further into each scene. One photo showed him at my front porch, just outside the frame. My heart raced as I recalled the afternoon. I was alone at home. The realization that he had been watching me sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I decided to leave the camera in the garage, hoping to forget about it. But when I woke up, it was sitting on my bedside table. Panic surged through me. I hadn't touched it. I quickly got up and grabbed it, ready to get rid of it for good. But as I turned to leave, I saw a new photograph in the developing tray. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, revealing a picture of my bedroom, taken from my bed. In the corner of the photo stood the old man, closer than ever, a sinister grin plastered on his face. I sprinted out of the house, leaving the camera behind. To this day, I refuse to go near that flea market, terrified that the old man might still be watching. The Whispering Woods. Every summer, my friends and I would camp in the woods near our town. This year was no different, and we set up our tents, excited for a weekend of fun. But that night, as we sat around the campfire, things took a turn. As the fire crackled and laughter filled the air, someone suggested a game of truth or dare. The days escalated quickly, and soon someone dared me to venture into the woods alone. I hesitated, but the group egged me on, so I reluctantly accepted. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the dark, trees looming overhead. The laughter faded behind me, replaced by an eerie silence. As I walked deeper, I felt a chill in the air, the wind whispering through the branches. Suddenly, I heard a soft voice, gentle and melodic. "Come closer." I froze, heart racing. "Hello." I called, but no one answered. I took a deep breath and decided to follow the sound, thinking it might be one of my friends playing a prank. The voice led me deeper into the woods, and the trees closed in around me. Just a little further, it coaxed. Panic started to set in. I turned to head back, but the path seemed unfamiliar. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices beckoning me to come closer. I stumbled backward, feeling disoriented. "Help us," they pleaded. A chilling echo that wrapped around me like a noose. I ran, heart pounding, branches clawing at my skin. The laughter from the campfire faded into the distance. I finally broke free of the trees, bursting into the clearing where my friends sat. They looked at me, eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" one asked. I don't know," I gasped, my breath coming in ragged bursts. There were voices. As I recounted my experience, a strange stillness fell over us. Then, without warning, the wind picked up and the whispering returned, floating through the air. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, none of us slept well, the voices lingering in our minds. We left the woods early the next morning, vowing never to return. But sometimes I still hear the whispers in the wind, calling me back. The cabin. Last summer, my friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was picturesque, nestled among towering trees and surrounded by a serene lake. But from the moment we arrived, I felt an unsettling vibe. On the first night, we decided to explore the area around the cabin. As we walked, we stumbled upon an old, decrepit shed hidden among the trees. Curiosity got the better of us, and we pried the door open. Inside, we found an array of dusty tools and old photographs. One photo caught my eye. A group of people standing outside the cabin, their faces eerily blank. I could have sworn one of the figures looked just like me. I felt a chill, brushing it off as a trick of the light. That night, we gathered around the fire, sharing ghost stories. I mentioned the photograph, and my friends laughed it off, encouraging me to take a picture of the shed the next day. As I fell asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia and drifted off. The next day, I went to the shed to snap a photo. As I did, I noticed something strange. The air grew thick, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I tried to pry it open. "Guys!" I yelled, but my friends didn't hear me. The air grew colder, and shadows danced around me, whispering indistinguishable words. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and standing there was one of the figures from the photograph, the one who looked like me. Its face was a mirror image, but twisted and grotesque. "Help me," it rasped, reaching out. With a surge of adrenaline, I finally forced the door open and stumbled out, gasping for breath. I ran back to the cabin, my heart racing. My friends were sitting on the porch, laughing, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I told them everything, but they shrugged it off as an overactive imagination. That night, as we sat around the fire, I noticed the shadows shifting again, and the whispers returned. "Join us." We left the next morning, and I swore I'd never return to that cabin again. To this day, I can still hear the echoes of that voice in my dreams, calling me back to the shed. The old woman. When I moved into my new apartment, I quickly learned about the elderly woman who lived in the unit next to mine. She was a recluse, rarely seen, but sometimes I'd hear her shuffling around late at night. It didn't bother me until I started hearing her voice. It began with soft murmurs that drifted through the walls. I dismissed it as her talking to herself, but over time, the whispers grew clearer. One night, I distinctly heard her say, "Help me, please." Concerned, I knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again, but still nothing. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd check again later. A few nights later, the whispers turned into frantic pleas. "Help me. I'm trapped." I felt a chill run down my spine. Unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to investigate. I knocked on her door again, this time with more urgency. Still no answer. My curiosity got the better of me, and I turned the knob. It was unlocked. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. As I stepped inside, I felt an unsettling energy in the air. The apartment was cluttered with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. I wandered deeper into the apartment, searching for her. As I reached the bedroom, I found her lying on the bed, her frail body barely moving. She looked up at me with hollow eyes, and a strange smile crept across her face. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice almost a hiss. "I've been waiting." "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to suppress my fear. She chuckled softly. "I'm free now. You can help me join them." Confused, I took a step back. "Join who?" Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I felt a chill envelop me. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that twisted and contorted. I realized with horror that the room was full of pictures, photos of her with other people, but they all had the same hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Join us," the voices echoed, now coming from all around me. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of pleas and laughter. Desperate, I pushed against the door until it finally gave way. I stumbled out, gasping for breath. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I never saw her again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers through the walls, calling me to join her in the darkness. The neighbor's dog. I had just moved into a new neighborhood, and everything seemed peaceful until I noticed my neighbor's dog. It was a large, dark creature, always barking at odd hours. At first, I thought it was just being protective, but then I started hearing other things. One night, as I settled into bed, I heard the dog howling. It wasn't a normal bark. It sounded almost mournful. I tried to ignore it, but the noise continued, echoing through the stillness of the night. The next morning, I saw my neighbor outside. "What's up with your dog?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged. "He's been acting strange lately. I think he senses something." That unnerved me. If the dog sensed something, what did that mean for me? I tried to brush it off, but the howling persisted, growing louder and more frantic each night. One evening, I heard scratching at my front door. My heart raced. I looked through the peephole, and there it was, the neighbor's dog, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes. I felt an odd sense of dread wash over me. "Go home." I shouted through the door, but the dog just whimpered and continued to scratch. In a moment of panic, I opened the door slightly, but the dog didn't move. Instead, it turned its head toward the woods behind my house, growling lowly. I'd followed its gaze and felt my stomach drop. There was a figure standing in the shadows watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. The howling reached a fever pitch outside, and I could hear the dog barking in panic. I called my neighbor, but there was no answer. That night, the howling turned into a cacophony of barks and cries. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, it stopped. The silence was deafening, but I felt an oppressive weight in the air. Suddenly, the dog began to howl again, but this time it sounded different. It was more of a wailing, as if it were in pain. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, ready to confront whatever was out there. The yard was empty, but the dog was gone. I called my neighbor again, but he still didn't answer. The next morning, I found out the dog had disappeared. My neighbor looked frantic, searching the woods and calling its name. I never saw that dog again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear a mournful howl in the distance, reminding me of the figure in the shadows. The door in the basement. When I bought my first house, I was thrilled to find it had a basement. It was spacious and dry, perfect for storage. I spent the first few weeks moving in and organizing my things, but one day I stumbled upon an old, locked door in the corner. Curiosity gnawed at me. I tried to find the key but had no luck. Days passed, and I could feel the door calling to me. It was an unsettling feeling, but I couldn't resist the urge to know what lay behind it. Finally, I decided to break the lock. I grabbed a crowbar and forced the door open. A musty smell wafted out, and I flicked on my flashlight, revealing a dark room filled with dust and cobwebs. In the center stood a rickety table, covered in strange symbols and old photographs. I stepped inside, heart racing. The photographs depicted people. Some looked familiar, but others were strangers. They'd all had one thing in common. They were all smiling, but their eyes were empty, void of life. As I examined the pictures, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, causing the door to creak shut behind me. I turned quickly, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and I tried to push it open, but it felt as if something was holding it shut. Suddenly, I heard whispering, soft, unintelligible words floating around me. I could feel a presence in the room, something dark and heavy. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the whispering stopped abruptly. "Help us!" A voice hissed from the shadows. I turned to the door again, desperate to escape. "Let me out!" I screamed, banging on the wood. But the whispers resumed, growing louder and more frantic. In a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself against the door one last time, and it swung open. I fell out onto the basement floor, gasping for breath. I scrambled up and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I locked it tight and vowed never to go back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers echoing from the basement, begging for release. The playroom. As a child, I spent countless hours playing in my grandmother's old house. One room always fascinated me, the playroom, filled with vintage toys and faded pictures. It felt magical, but also strange, like it was stuck in time. One day, while exploring, I found an old doll tucked away in a corner. Its porcelain face was cracked, but its eyes seemed to follow me. I picked it up, feeling an odd connection. I decided to take it home, hoping to clean it up. That night, I placed the doll on my shelf and went to bed. I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of giggling. Groggy and confused, I sat up, looking around. The room was dark, but I could see the doll sitting on my shelf, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Come play with me," a soft voice whispered. I froze, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no answer. I felt the air grow colder, and the giggling grew louder. Terrified, I turned on my bedside lamp, but the room was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found the doll on my bed, even though I was sure I had left it on the shelf. I shivered but decided to ignore it. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I'd find toys scattered across the floor, even though I had left them neatly arranged. The whispers continued at night, becoming more insistent. "Come play, come play." One night, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the doll, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" I demanded. The air grew thick, and the whispers turned to laughter. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The doll's eyes seemed to glow, and it whispered, "Playtime isn't over yet." I bolted from the room, grabbing my things and running to my grandmother's house. I returned the doll, hoping to rid myself of its dark influence. But even now, I can still hear the laughter echoing in my mind, waiting for me to return. The shadow under the bed. As a kid, I had a terrifying fear of the dark. My parents assured me there was nothing to be afraid of, but every night I would check under my bed, convinced something was lurking there. One night, after a particularly long day, I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up suddenly, feeling a chill wash over me. The room was pitch dark, and I could sense something in the corner. My heart raced. I remembered my childhood fears and hesitated. But then I heard it, a soft whisper. "Help me." I sat up, my breath quickening. I remembered the stories about things that lurked under beds, but I couldn't resist the call. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed a figure lying on the floor, its face obscured. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Who are you?" I stammered. The figure shifted, and I could see its hollow eyes staring back at me. "Help me." "I'm trapped," it whispered, reaching out a bony hand. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled back, slamming my body against the wall. "Get away," I screamed. The figure began to rise, a shadowy form stretching toward me. I could feel its cold breath, and I knew I had to escape. I leaped from my bed and bolted for the door, flinging it open and running down the hall. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, terrified to return to my room. The next day, I told my parents what had happened, but they brushed it off as a nightmare. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. I gathered my courage and returned to my room, but the shadows felt thicker, more oppressive. I checked under the bed one last time, but nothing was there. Years later, I still have a fear of the dark, and sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, calling out from the shadows, begging for help. The forgotten child. When I moved into my new apartment, I quickly noticed strange things happening. It was an old building, and the walls had seen better days, but I was excited to make it my own. One night, as I was unpacking, I heard a soft giggle coming from the hallway. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the laughter continued, echoing off the walls. I stepped out of my apartment, but the hallway was empty. As days passed, the laughter grew more frequent. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, like a ghostly echo. One evening, I decided to confront it. "Is anyone there?" I called, but only silence answered me. That night, I woke up to a tugging on my blanket. I sat up, heart racing, and saw a small figure at the foot of my bed. It was a little girl, her hair tangled and her eyes wide and sad. "Help me," she whispered. I froze, unable to move. "What do you need?" I finally managed to ask. "Find my home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Before I could respond, she vanished into thin air. I was left alone, shaken and confused. The next day, I decided to investigate. I asked my neighbors about the little girl, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. That night, the girl returned, and this time she looked more desperate. "You have to help me," she urged. "I can't find my family." I agreed to help her, though I had no idea how. She pointed down the hallway, and I followed her lead. The laughter had turned into soft sobs, echoing through the dark corridors. As I reached the end of the hall, I found a door that had been locked. With trembling hands, I knocked, but no one answered. "This is where I used to live," the girl said. "I need to go home." With newfound determination, I forced the door open. Inside, the room was covered in dust, but I could see remnants of a child's life, old toys, pictures on the walls, and a bed neatly made. I turned to the girl, but she had vanished again. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me. That night, I returned to my apartment, haunted by her words. Days turned into weeks, and the girl never returned. I'd often wondered if I had imagined it all, but the laughter still echoed in the hallways, reminding me of the forgotten child. The missing room. When I first moved into my new house, I was excited to explore every inch of it. It was older, with creaky floors and a certain charm. However, I quickly discovered something strange. One of the rooms was missing. The layout of the house didn't make sense. There was a door in the hallway that led to a blank wall. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I assumed it was just an old maintenance issue and moved on. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden behind that door. I asked my neighbors about it, but they merely shrugged and said they hadn't thought about it in years. One night, I couldn't sleep, consumed by curiosity. I approached the door again, feeling a compulsion to know what was behind it. I knocked softly, and to my shock, the door creaked open a fraction, revealing a dark abyss. I hesitated but stepped inside. The air felt thick, and a wave of unease washed over me. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. It was empty, save for a dusty old mirror standing against the wall. As I approached the mirror, I felt a chill. My reflection stared back, but it looked different, distorted, with a shadow lurking just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Let me out," a voice whispered from the mirror. Terrified, I stumbled back. I tried to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The mirror began to ripple like water, and the figure stepped out, a twisted version of myself, with dark, hollow eyes. "Help me," it whispered, reaching out. In a panic, I grabbed the doorknob and pushed with all my strength. The door burst open, and I fell into the hallway. I slammed it shut and locked it tight, heart pounding. I never returned to that room. Now, I can still feel the mirror's gaze on me, and I often wonder what lies behind that door, waiting for someone to let it out. The unseen roommate. I moved into a shared apartment with a couple of friends, excited to start this new chapter. Everything was going smoothly until I started hearing strange noises at night. At first, I thought it was just the creaks of an old building. But then, I began to notice odd occurrences. Doors would be left open that I was sure I had closed, and I would sometimes hear soft whispers when everyone else was asleep. One night, I was awoken by the sound of someone pacing in the kitchen. I rubbed my eyes and crept out to investigate. The lights were off, but I could see a shadow moving back and forth. I called out, "Is someone there?" No response. My heart raced as I cautiously approached the kitchen. I turned on the light, but there was no one there. I checked the apartment. My roommates were all sound asleep. The next day, I asked them if they had heard anything strange, but they brushed it off. I decided to keep it to myself, thinking I was just being paranoid. The disturbances continued. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, nothing would be there. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a weight pressing down on my chest. I opened my eyes to find a dark figure hovering above me, its face obscured. "Help me," it whispered, and I felt a cold breath on my skin. I screamed and jumped out of bed, but the figure vanished. I stumbled into the living room, gasping for breath. My roommates woke up, confused and concerned. "I saw something," I exclaimed, but they were skeptical. They assured me it was just a dream and urged me to relax. But I knew what I had seen. I decided to confront whatever was in the apartment. That night, I sat in the living room, waiting. I spoke aloud, "If you're here, show yourself." Silence hung heavy in the air. Just as I was about to give up, the lights flickered, and I heard a soft voice say, "Help me." The room grew cold, and the shadows began to twist and writhe. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. "What do you want?" I shouted, but the shadows only deepened. In a moment of fear, I bolted to the front door and fled into the night, not looking back. I moved out the next day, leaving my friends and that unseen presence behind. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers calling for help. The locket. I found an old locket while hiking in the woods near my house. It was buried in the dirt, and something compelled me to pick it up. It was ornate and beautiful, but when I opened it, I found a faded photograph of a woman with hollow eyes staring back at me. That night, I placed the locket on my bedside table. As I lay in bed, I felt a strange energy surrounding me. It was as if the woman in the locket was watching me. I fell asleep, but soon awoke to a soft voice. "Help me," it whispered. I sat up, heart racing, and glanced at the locket. The photograph had changed. The woman now looked distressed, her mouth moving silently. Terrified, I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a dream. But when I opened them again, the room was cold and shadows danced along the walls. "Help me," the voice repeated, now more urgent. I got out of bed, trembling, and picked up the locket. The voice seemed to come from within it. I had to know more. I researched the locket and found out that the woman had gone missing years ago, her case never solved. That night, I held the locket tightly in my hands and spoke aloud. "What happened to you?" Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me. "You need to find me," the voice pleaded. "I'm lost." I felt compelled to return to the woods where I found it. The next day, I hiked back, locket in hand. As I reached the spot where I found it, I felt a pull toward a cluster of trees. I began to dig in the ground, heart pounding. The deeper I went, the more the whispers grew, urging me on. Finally, I uncovered a small box. Inside was a tattered diary belonging to the woman, filled with sorrowful entries. As I read the last entry, I felt a rush of cold air, and the voice cried out, "Thank you." The locket slipped from my fingers and fell into the box, which closed tightly on its own. I ran back home, knowing I had finally set her spirit free. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her whispers, echoing in the back of my mind. The old photo album. While cleaning out my grandmother's attic, I stumbled upon an old, dusty photo album. The leather cover was cracked, and I could barely make out the family crest embossed on it. Curious, I flipped it open. The first few pages contained photos of my grandparents' wedding and family gatherings. But as I turned further, the images became unsettling. They were of people I didn't recognize, faces twisted in fear, eyes wide and pleading. One photo caught my attention. A group of children standing in front of a dilapidated house. I felt a chill as I noticed the girl on the far left. She looked exactly like me at that age, down to the same dress and hairstyle. The date written beneath it was from the early 1900s. Confused and slightly disturbed, I continued flipping through the album. The further I went, the more the pictures changed. The faces grew increasingly grotesque, as if they were aging rapidly before my eyes. Suddenly, I reached a page with no picture, just a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Help us. We're trapped." I slammed the album shut, my heart racing. I felt a strange compulsion to return to that house in the photo, a feeling I couldn't shake. After some digging, I found out it was located just outside of town, abandoned for decades. That weekend, I drove there. The house was overgrown and ominous, but I felt an undeniable pull to go inside. As I stepped through the threshold, the air grew thick with a sense of dread. I wandered from room to room, but it was the attic that drew me in. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. The attic was filled with dust-covered furniture and old toys, but in the corner was an old mirror, its surface tarnished. I approached it cautiously, and as I looked into the glass, the reflection shifted. I saw the same children from the photo, trapped behind the glass, their faces twisted in despair. "Help us," they cried, and the mirror began to ripple. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes. I turned to run, but the attic door slammed shut. I pounded on it, screaming for help. The children's voices echoed around me, growing louder and more frantic. Just when I thought I was going to be trapped forever, the door burst open. I fell out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I scrambled down the stairs and fled the house, never looking back. Now, I keep that photo album locked away, but I can still hear their cries sometimes, echoing in the silence. The man in the suit. I worked late nights at a small law firm, often being the last one in the office. The building was old and creaked with every gust of wind. One night, as I was finishing up a case, I noticed a figure outside my office door, a man in a dark suit. He stood perfectly still, just out of the light. "Can I help you?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He simply stared at me, his face obscured by shadow. Feeling uneasy, I tried to ignore him and return to my work. But when I looked up again, he was gone. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The following night, I stayed late again. This time, as I packed up my things, I glanced at the doorway. The man was there again, standing in the same spot. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stepped forward slightly, and I could see his eyes, dark and hollow, like empty pits. "You're in danger," he said, his voice low and chilling. "You need to leave." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. When the light flickered on, he was gone again. I bolted for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the door, I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned to see the man standing right behind me. "Leave now," he shouted, and I stumbled back, nearly falling as I fled the building. I never returned to that office late at night. Months later, I learned that a former lawyer had died in the building under mysterious circumstances. I sometimes think of the man in the suit, wondering if he was trying to protect me, or if he was something far more sinister. The library whisper. I've always loved libraries, their quiet serenity a perfect escape from the chaos of the world. So when I found an old, secluded library while traveling, I was eager to explore. As I wandered through the dusty shelves, I stumbled upon a section filled with ancient books. One, in particular, caught my eye, a leather-bound tome that seemed to hum with energy. I pulled it from the shelf and opened it, but the pages were blank. Disappointed, I put it back and continued browsing, but a whisper caught my attention. "Help me," it seemed to say, barely audible. I looked around, but no one was there. Thinking I was imagining things, I returned to my search. But the whispering persisted, becoming more insistent. "Help me. Find me." I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to leave the section, but as I turned, I saw a shadow flitting between the shelves. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I followed the shadow deeper into the library. Eventually, I found myself in a dark alcove. There, sitting on the floor, was a small figure, an old woman with a hollow gaze. "Help me," she repeated, her voice soft and sorrowful. "What do you need?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I've been trapped here for so long. she whispered, her hand reaching out. "You must find my book." Panicking, I looked around but didn't see any other books. "Which one?" I cried out. "Follow the whispers," she said, and suddenly the shadows grew darker around me. I felt a pull towards the far end of the library, where I had seen that strange leather-bound tome. I rushed back, my heart racing. I picked it up again, and this time the pages began to fill with words of desperation and despair. The old woman's voice echoed in my mind. "You must release me. Read it aloud." Without thinking, I began to read. As I spoke the words, the air crackled and the room darkened. The old woman appeared beside me, her form flickering like a candle flame. "Thank you," she cried, and in an instant she vanished. The book slammed shut and the whispers faded. I stumbled back, feeling lightheaded. I left the library, shaken, and never looked back. To this day, I wonder if the old woman found peace, or if she still wanders the stacks, waiting for someone to help her. The mirror in the hallway. In my childhood home, there was a long, narrow hallway lined with mirrors. My parents always warned me not to stare too long, claiming they could play tricks on your mind. As a teenager, I was skeptical and often found myself gazing into the mirrors, mesmerized by my own reflection. One night, I was home alone, and as I walked down the hallway, I paused to look at myself. But something was off. My reflection seemed to lag behind, as if it were a moment slower than reality. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as fatigue, but the feeling lingered. That night, I heard a soft tapping coming from the hallway. I got up to investigate and saw my reflection in one of the mirrors, staring back at me with an unsettling grin. It wasn't me, not really. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice echoing through the stillness. I stumbled back, heart racing. "What do you mean?" I shouted. "Help me," it hissed, its smile widening. "I want to be free." Terrified, I turned to run, but the mirrors seemed to shimmer and distort, trapping me in their grasp. I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch the glass, but I fought it, screaming for help. Just then, the tapping grew louder, reverberating around me. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a nearby vase and smashed it against the mirror. The glass shattered and the reflection twisted, letting out a terrible shriek. I fled back to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found the hallway empty, the mirrors intact, but I knew something had changed. I covered the mirrors with sheets and avoided the hallway altogether. Sometimes I still hear the whispers at night, calling out for freedom, but I never dared to look again. The Forgotten Doll. When I was a child, I had a collection of dolls that my grandmother gifted me. They were old-fashioned, with porcelain faces and delicate dresses. One day, I found a doll that I had never seen before, hidden in the back of the closet. It had a cracked face and a tattered dress, but something about it intrigued me. I decided to take it out and display it on my shelf. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange energy filling the room. I could have sworn I heard soft giggles and whispers coming from the doll. "Play with me," a voice echoed in my mind. I brushed it off as a figment of my imagination, but the next morning, I found the doll had changed positions. Its head was turned slightly, as if it had been watching me while I slept. A shiver ran down my spine. Over the next few days, things escalated. I began to find my toys scattered around my room, and I would often hear the soft laughter at night. I confronted the doll, demanding it to stop, but the giggling only grew louder. One night, I awoke to find the doll sitting at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing in the dark. "Let's play," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Panicking, I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, but when I returned, the doll was gone. I searched the house, but it was nowhere to be found. The next morning, I found it back on my shelf, as if it had never left. Terrified, I decided to throw it away. I watched as the garbage truck took it away, feeling a sense of relief. But that night, I woke up to the sound of soft giggles again. I looked around, heart pounding. Then, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned to see the doll, its eyes filled with dark glee. "You can't get rid of me that easily," it whispered. The text message. It started as an ordinary day. I was at work when I received a text from an unknown number. "I'm watching you." I brushed it off as a prank, maybe a wrong number. Later that night, I received another message. "You should check your closet." My heart raced. I had left my closet slightly ajar, but I was home alone. "Who is this?" I replied, but there was no answer. I felt uneasy as I tried to go about my evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found myself glancing at the closet repeatedly, dread pooling in my stomach. Just as I was about to settle down, my phone buzzed again, closer than you think. I jumped, my pulse quickening. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the closet, heart pounding in my ears. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice shaky. I opened the door wide, revealing darkness inside. My mind raced with thoughts of intruders and hidden dangers. Suddenly, my phone lit up again. "You're too late." In that moment, I felt something brush against my ankle. I yelped and swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. I could feel my heart in my throat, terror gripping me. Just then, my phone buzzed again. "I'm in the room." I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I turned slowly, shining the light around my bedroom. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner watching me. I screamed and bolted for the front door, flinging it open and running into the night. I never went back home that night. I spent hours at a friend's place, too scared to return. The next day, I went back, but everything seemed normal. The messages stopped, and I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear my phone buzz, and I can't help but wonder who, or what, was watching me. The Whispering Woods. My friends and I often went hiking in the nearby woods, which were known for their beauty and serenity. But one evening, we decided to explore a part of the forest that was said to be haunted. As we ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The trees felt denser, the air thicker, and a strange tension hung in the air. Suddenly, we'd heard whispers drifting through the branches, barely audible. "Help us, find us," they seemed to call. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends asked, looking uneasy. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind," I replied, but I wasn't convinced. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around us like a thick fog. "Let's go back," another friend suggested, clearly frightened. But curiosity got the better of me, and I urged them to keep going. As we moved deeper into the woods, we found an old, abandoned cabin. The whispers intensified, almost pleading. "Help us, please." We stepped inside, and the air felt heavy. Old furniture was covered in dust, and the windows were boarded up. In the corner, we found a dusty old diary. As I flipped through the pages, I saw entries from someone who had gone missing long ago. The last entry was frantic, filled with desperation. "They won't let me leave. I can hear them whispering." Suddenly, the whispers turned into screams, echoing around us. "Get out! Help us!" they cried. Panic set in, and we bolted from the cabin, racing back through the trees. As we stumbled out of the woods, the whispers faded, but the memory haunted us. We never spoke of it again, but I still hear those cries in my mind, wondering who or what was lost in those woods. The photograph. During a family reunion, I found an old, dusty box filled with photographs. As I sifted through them, I stumbled upon an eerie image of my grandparents standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. There was something off about the photo. Their smiles seemed forced, and the house appeared twisted, almost as if it were alive. I asked my family about it, but they had no recollection of the place. That night, I decided to investigate further. I took the photo to a local historian who specialized in our town's history. He looked at it, and his face paled. "That house burned down years ago," he said. "Everyone inside perished." I felt a chill run down my spine. Why did my grandparents look so happy in front of a house that had been destroyed? Determined to find out more, I went to the site where the house once stood. All that remained were charred ruins and overgrown grass. As I stood there, I felt a sense of unease, as if the ground beneath me was whispering secrets. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned to see a figure in the distance, standing among the trees. They looked familiar, and as I squinted, I realized it was my grandparents. "Help us," they called, their voices echoing through the air. I stumbled back, heart racing. I blinked, and they were gone. I fled the site, shaken and confused. Now, I keep that photograph tucked away, but sometimes I feel their presence, lost and searching, just beyond my reach. The ritual. I was invited to a friend's house for a small gathering one Halloween. It was all fun and games until someone suggested we play a game called The Ritual. Curiosity piqued. I joined in. We gathered in a dark room, lit only by flickering candles. The rules were simple. We each had to take turns, saying our deepest fear aloud while the others chatted. When it was my turn, I hesitated but finally spoke. I'm afraid of being trapped. The room fell silent, and I felt a cold draft sweep through. The candles flickered violently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The others continued chanting, and I felt a heaviness settle in the air. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the candles extinguished, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through the group, and I felt a suffocating pressure around me. "Open the door!" someone shouted, but it wouldn't budge. I felt as if the walls were closing in, and whispers began to swirl around us. Dark, sinister voices. "Help us! Trapped!" they echoed. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Just when I thought we were lost forever, the door swung open, and a rush of cold air flooded in. We stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The atmosphere felt different, almost alive. We never spoke of the incident again, but I still feel that darkness lingering in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. The broken clock. I inherited an old grandfather clock from my great-aunt, who was known for her eccentricity and love of the supernatural. I was excited to have it in my home, even if it did seem a little out of place in my modern apartment. The first night, I noticed that the clock struck midnight, even though it hadn't worked in years. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But as the days passed, the clock continued to chime at odd hours, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, always echoing through the quiet of the night. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint whispering coming from the clock. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound grew clearer, and I could swear I heard my great-aunt's voice saying, "Help me. I'm trapped." Panicking, I got out of bed and approached the clock. It felt strangely warm to the touch. As I reached out to wind it, the whispering grew louder, almost pleading. "Please, help." In a moment of fear, I yanked the clock away from the wall, and it crashed to the floor, splintering into pieces. The room fell silent, but I felt a chill wash over me. In the wreckage, I found a hidden compartment containing an old locket and a note. The note read, "Time is not what it seems. You must free me." I was horrified. I quickly stuffed the locket back into the compartment and covered it with the remaining pieces of the clock. I never spoke of it again, but sometimes, at the stroke of midnight, I can still hear her whispering. The abandoned asylum. One night, a group of friends and I decided to explore an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. We'd heard the stories, ghosts, strange noises, and unsettling encounters, but curiosity got the better of us. As we entered, the atmosphere changed. The air was thick, and a sense of dread settled in. The halls were dark, and the peeling wallpaper added to the eerie ambience. We turned on our flashlights and ventured deeper inside. In one of the rooms, we found old medical equipment and faded photographs of patients. My friend Matt joked about how they might still be watching us. Just then, we heard a soft whisper echo through the hall, "Leave." We froze, exchanging nervous glances. "That was just the wind," I said, but deep down, I felt a chill. We pressed on, but the atmosphere grew heavier. Doors creaked open and shut on their own, and we heard faint cries echoing through the halls. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, beckoning us to leave. As we made our way to the basement, the whispers grew louder, now sounding desperate. "Help us, free us," Matt dared to say. "What if we find something down there?" His bravado faded when the lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through, extinguishing our flashlights. Panic set in, and we rushed back upstairs. But as we ran, I felt something grab my ankle, pulling me down. I screamed, and my friends turned back, eyes wide with terror. Just as suddenly as it happened, the grip released, and I scrambled to my feet. We bolted for the exit, and as we burst outside, we heard a cacophony of anguished screams behind us. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers calling for help in my dreams. The Watcher in the Woods. I had always loved hiking alone. There's something serene about being enveloped by nature, away from the noise of everyday life. But one particular trip into the woods changed everything. It was late autumn, the leaves a fiery tapestry of red and gold. I set off early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. As I ventured deeper, the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. Nature can be quiet sometimes. After a couple of hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a beautiful scene that felt almost surreal. I decided to take a break, sipping water while soaking in the tranquility. But as I sat there, a strange feeling washed over me, as if I was being watched. I glanced around, dismissing the thought as paranoia, just the trees, I told myself. Yet the feeling persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I stood up, trying to shake off the unease, and decided it was time to head back. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees. My heart raced. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but nothing was there. Just shadows playing tricks on me, I reasoned. I quickened my pace, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. The path I had taken now felt foreign. Every twist and turn seemed unfamiliar, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, but all I saw were the gnarled branches swaying in the wind. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led back toward the parking area, the other deeper into the woods. My gut told me to take the first, but something tugged at my curiosity. I took the second path, convinced it would lead me back quicker. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees closed in, their twisted trunks and thick branches blocking the sunlight. I heard a faint rustling behind me, but chose to ignore it, focusing on finding my way back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing, one I had never seen before. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. Just as I started to turn back, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, among the trees, stood a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes staring directly at me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he wore tattered clothing that blended with the bark of the trees. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raspy and barely audible. I could see his mouth moving, but I felt a pull inside me not to approach him. I turned to run, heart pounding, but he called out again, "You can't escape." The words chilled me to the bone. I bolted down the path, branches snagging at my clothes, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't look back until I reached the fork again. The other path seemed like a bad idea, but I had no choice. I chose it, praying it would lead me out. I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, fueled by adrenaline. Finally, I spotted a glimmer of light through the trees, the parking area. I sprinted toward it, fear giving me strength. I burst through the tree line and into the open, collapsing against my car. I looked back, half expecting the figure to emerge from the woods. But there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the fading light of day. I drove away, heart racing, vowing never to hike alone again. Months later, I still think about that day. What was that figure? Was he really lost, or was he something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear his voice echoing in my mind, a reminder that not all who wander in the woods make it back. The caller. I had just settled into bed when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, half expecting a robocall. "Hello," I said, but all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. I hung up, brushing it off as a prank. It was late, after all. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was the same number. I ignored it, feeling uneasy. Then came the text. "I see you." My heart sank. I glanced out my window into the darkness, seeing only my quiet street. Trying to shake off the fear, I turned off my phone and went to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced, imagining the worst. The next morning, I received another message. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I decided to block the number. A week passed, and I thought I was in the clear. Then, late one night, I heard a noise outside my window, a soft tapping. My heart raced as I crept to the curtain, peering through the slats. Nothing, just the empty street. I returned to bed, feeling foolish for being scared. Then my phone buzzed again. It was a new message, "Look outside." My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring at the screen. Against my better judgment, I approached the window. When I looked out, my heart dropped. There, in the moonlight, stood a figure. I couldn't see their face, but they were staring directly at me. Panicking, I backed away, tripping over my own feet. I fumbled for my phone to call the police. Just as I hit dial, the figure moved closer. I could barely breathe, fear paralyzing me. Then I heard the most chilling sound, my own voice echoing from the phone. "I see you." I turned to my screen in horror, realizing the figure was right outside, mocking me. The basement. My grandmother's house was old and creaky, but I loved visiting her during the summer. She had a basement filled with antiques, and one day curiosity got the better of me. I ventured down the rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. Dust danced in the beams of light filtering through the small window. My grandmother had always warned me never to go down there alone, but I was determined to explore. As I rummaged through boxes, I found an old, ornate mirror. It looked out of place, the glass clouded with age. I wiped it with my sleeve, and my reflection blinked back at me, except it didn't look quite right. For a moment, I saw not just myself, but a dark figure behind me in the mirror. I spun around, but the basement was empty. Shaking off the sensation, I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but now my reflection looked distorted, grinning maliciously. I felt a chill run down my spine. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, attempting to shake off my fear. But every time I looked away, I could feel its presence creeping closer. Suddenly, I heard my grandmother calling from upstairs. Relieved, I set the mirror down and rushed to the stairs. As I ascended, I glanced back. The reflection was still there, grinning wider. I never went back to the basement again. To this day, I wonder what I really saw that day. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear whispers from below, beckoning me to return. The doll. I inherited an old porcelain doll from my aunt when she passed away. It was beautiful, albeit a bit eerie with its cracked face and lifelike eyes. I placed it on my shelf, but soon after strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. I'd find the doll turn slightly, its gaze seemingly following me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then one night, I awoke to the sound of soft giggling. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:00 a.m. My heart raced as I listened. The giggling continued, growing louder. I sat up, scanning my dark room. That's when I noticed the doll was no longer on the shelf. I leaped out of bed, scanning the room in a panic. Suddenly, I spotted it in the corner, standing upright on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, revealing the doll standing there, as if it had been placed intentionally. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and put it back on the shelf. The giggling stopped immediately, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. I convinced myself it was a prank or a dream. The next day, I decided to get rid of the doll. I placed it in a box and took it to the local thrift shop. As soon as I got home, my phone buzzed. A notification from a social media group. Look what I found. It was a picture of the doll, smiling eerily from the shop window. Panic surged through me. I rushed back to the store, but the doll was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Now I keep hearing that giggle, sometimes in the dead of night. I'm terrified it's coming for me, that it's still out there, waiting for me to take it back. The shadow in the hall. It was a rainy night, and I had just settled in for a cozy evening with a book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I felt safe in my little apartment. As I turned the pages, I noticed a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision. I glanced up, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I focused on my book, but the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Eventually, I decided to make some tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I walked into the kitchen, I felt it again, a chill creeping up my spine. I turned to look back at the hallway. This time, I was sure I saw something move. It was quick, just a blur, but it felt like it was watching me. My heart raced. I made my tea and returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. After finishing a few pages, I decided to take a break and check my phone. As I scrolled, I heard a soft whisper echo from the hallway. "Come play." I froze. My throat tightened. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, but something deep inside urged me to stay silent, to not respond. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Come play with me." Terror gripped me. I tiptoed to the hallway, peering into the darkness. My heart pounded.